It's a busy week in the church calendar. We had on the 25th Christmas Day, on the 26th the Feast of St. Stephen, on the 27th the Feast of St. John, on the 28th the Feast of the Holy Innocents, on the 29th the Feast of St. Thomas a Becket, and here we are today on the 30th, on the first Sunday after Christmas. It's been a busy week. I don't know whether you've all been observing those various festivities, but it's a busy time in the church calendar, and we remember so many things. St. Stephen, the first Christian martyr, professed his faith and was stoned to death, proclaimed that even if he was quieted, the very stones would shout out that Jesus is Lord. St. John the Evangelist, that we remember on the 27th, the great evangelist, the gospel that we haven't read this morning, but the evangelist St. John, and then the Holy Innocents. The Holy Innocents, all these boy children under the age of 1 or 2 who were killed in Bethlehem in a hope of being able to kill the King of the Jews, the Prince of Peace, Jesus' baby. And then Thomas a Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was murdered in 1170 because King Henry II said, "Who will rid me of this troublesome priest?" I confess to you, when I was reading a little about St. Thomas a Becket, I thought that King Henry II was remarkably restrained, because he was a very meddlesome priest, very difficult. And to try and negotiate any settlement between state and church, he was really a pain in the backside. I'm sorry to say so, but he was. So I'm not saying that killing him was the right solution, but it was a very difficult time in the relationship between church and state. And clearly, at the top of St. Thomas's mind was not the passage we heard this morning from Colossians, where we are called to forgive and to love. Here we are on the first Sunday after Christmas, and the gospel passage for today is this passage of Jesus coming to his parents, with his parents to Jerusalem to come to the temple when he is 12 years old. And maybe, like you, like me, you wonder what happened in those 12 years. The gap. What possibly could have happened to Jesus? Interesting stories in apocryphal Gospels and also in the Quran tell us some of the tales that may have happened to Jesus. The Quran has Mary giving birth to Jesus leaning against a date palm. And as she suffers in her labor, so the roots of the palm give her water and the tree bends down to feed her dates. We have, journeying back from Egypt, various stories, and there are churches dedicated to the time that the Holy Family spent in Egypt. But what we know is that fairly early on, already at his first year, Jesus was essentially back in the Holy Land. And year after year, his parents would have undertaken with him this journey to Jerusalem. It's 104 kilometers. 104 kilometers from Nazareth to Jerusalem. And when I looked it up, it said now if you travel at 112 kilometers an hour average, because the road is further, it'll take you 1 hour and 30 minutes. That was not the case. Walking 104 kilometers as a group traveling together with young children and with babies in arms. Some would have had donkeys, others would have just walked the whole way. There's no way you could have done it more than 20 kilometers in a day, and even then 20 kilometers in a day is a long distance to cover. 5 days to journey down to Jerusalem from Nazareth for these festivities every year. And then Jesus stays behind in the temple. I don't know how many of you have had teenagers who know everything and all the answers, and I can think that Mary and Joseph must have been pulling their hair out at the casual way in which Jesus said, "Didn't you know I had to be in my Father's house?" No consideration for his parents. And this is true. No consideration for his parents. And so I think that this is always one of the useful things for us to see, because it is showing us that in Jesus' humanity he was completely human, as in his divinity he was completely divine. And part of his growing up process is described to us in this passage, because you can see Joseph and Mary understanding that the community was caring for him. The family was broader than just a mother and a father. They were sure Jesus was with relatives, with cousins, with neighbors, with friends, because we always say in an African setting that it takes a community to raise a child. And clearly this is the image that is given to us in this gospel passage as well. It is a community that raises its children. And what are the virtues that this community might want to give to the Christ child and to every other child? And so much of it is reflected in the fact that year by year, members of this community take this 5-day pilgrimage to Jerusalem and 5 days back. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine just for a moment what that means in everyday life? I always used to marvel in our family at the stories of the farms in the south of Namibia. In the 1950s, my uncle was farming still in the south of Namibia, no car, only a donkey cart. And his children had to go to Keetmanshoop to go to school. It was a 2-week journey to Keetmanshoop to take the kids to school. And then he had to journey back for 2 weeks. So every time he did that journey, my aunt was left on her own on the farm for a month. And the children could only come home once a year because of this huge journey. So the world that we live in today is different. The world have different priorities, and the way that we travel and move around is also very different. But there is something in the simplicity and the rhythm that we see of Jesus' upbringing that gives us the stability that we see later in the man. Jesus spent his 3 years of ministry walking, engaging with people, engaging with neighbors and friends, with fisherfolk, with workers, because this was the way that he had been raised. And this humble beginning then becomes the root of the way in which Jesus exercises his ministry. So on this first Sunday after Christmas, in a few days' time, we'll be celebrating the new year, going into new hopes, and maybe just bear in mind for yourself some of the simplicity that is at the heart of the formation of who Jesus the man is. And if you're inclined to make New Year's resolutions, perhaps think for yourself what it is that you can do to more fully align yourself to a space where you can leave room for God in in your life. Let 2019 be for you a year of rootedness in God. I pray this for each one of you as I pray it for myself.